The wind out of the north carried needles instead of snow, stinging the skin and chasing even the crows into hiding. It was the kind of cold that turned breath to frost and set fences groaning in their posts. On the edge of the prairie, where the land pitched down toward the river and then rose again into cottonwood hills, a woman trudged with a child on each hip and one walking at her side, hands swallowed in her coat sleeve. Her name was Clara Boone, though no one had called her that in months. Most days she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to still be somebody's name. The baby fussed against her shoulder, Rachel, barely a year and always hungry. Matthew, age 3, was silent but alert, his eyes scanning the empty land like he expected something to rise out of it. And Nell, 5 and sharp as cracked glass, didn't cry any more unless someone else did first. They had left the last town 3 days ago. No one would hire a woman with 3 mouths and no husband. The preacher's wife had given her a heel of bread and a wool scarf before closing the door. They'd slept 2 nights in an abandoned hay shed, one in a grain silo, and tonight Clara wasn't sure what they'd find. Her boots leaked, her back ached from Rachel's weight and the endless miles, but her jaw stayed set. Forward was the only direction left. They came to a bend in the wagon road as dusk fell, and beyond it, half-shadowed under a sagging bluff, was a square house built of stone and wood. The chimney trailed smoke, and the roof looked patched but whole. Chickens clucked somewhere behind it, and the faint odor of bread reached Clara's frozen nose. She hesitated. She didn't want to beg, she'd sworn she wouldn't again, but Nell's teeth were chattering and Rachel was too quiet now. Matthew leaned into her side and whispered, "Mama, please." So she walked up to the porch and knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. When it did, the man who answered said nothing. He filled the doorway like a tree rooted to earth. Tall, coatless despite the cold, with dark hair hanging to his collar and eyes that saw everything but gave nothing away. Behind him, a fire snapped in a stone hearth, and the scent of rye bread thickened. Clara cleared her throat. "I got 3 little ones," she said. "We just need a place to warm up, one night. I can work for it, clean or anything." The man's eyes moved to each child in turn. Nell held her chin high. Matthew hid his face. Rachel made a soft, sucking sound. He stepped aside. That was all, no word, no gesture. Just the quiet shift of his weight and the open door behind him. Clara hesitated just a breath longer, then stepped inside. The warmth struck her like a blow, so sudden it made her knees sag. The man shut the door and walked past them without a glance. He set another log on the fire, stirred a black pot that smelled of stew, then vanished through a back door. The room was plain but clean, worn rugs, a sturdy table, a cot in the corner, no trinkets, no woman's touch. Clara crouched near the hearth, unwrapping Rachel and holding her close to the heat. She looked over her shoulder. The man hadn't come back. "You can take your coats off," she told the other 2, "but stay close." Nell knelt beside her, eyes wide. "Is he gonna let us stay?" "I don't know," Clara whispered. An hour passed. The fire crackled and the stew pot bubbled. The man returned with a loaf of bread in one hand and 3 bowls in the other. He ladled stew into them, set them on the table, and poured water from a tin pitcher. He said nothing the whole time. Then he stepped back, arms folded, and waited. Clara lifted her chin. "What's your name?" He didn't answer. "I'm Clara. These are my children." Still silence, but he inclined his head, the faintest nod. She didn't press. She helped the children into chairs, tore the bread into pieces, and watched them eat like wolves. The stew was thick with beans and turnip, with shreds of pork so tender Clara nearly wept when she tasted it. He handed her the last bowl without a word. When the meal was done, the man fetched blankets and laid them near the hearth. He left again without a sound, vanishing into a back room and closing the door behind him. The children fell asleep quickly, warm and fed for the first time in days. Clara sat awake, watching the fire shrink. Her limbs trembled from the letting down, from safety she couldn't trust. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. He had bread, silence, and a spare room. She had 3 mouths to feed, and no home. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. She woke before dawn, the room still cloaked in ember light and the scent of yesterday's stew lingering in the air. Her back ached from the floorboards, but the ache felt honest. A reminder she'd survived the night. Rachel slept curled like a kitten against her ribs, and Matthew's tiny hand rested on her sleeve. Nell was already awake, sitting upright, watching the fire with eyes that never seemed to rest. The man, whoever he was, hadn't stirred. Clara rose slow so as not to wake the baby and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The window above the table glowed faint blue, a thin prelude to sunrise. Snow dusted the pane. She moved through the small house quietly. The kitchen was stocked plain but well: sacks of flour and beans, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, a row of root vegetables stacked against the wall. She spotted a broken wagon wheel propped in the corner, tools beside it, a rifle hung high on a peg. Every inch of the place spoke of work, measured, solitary, unbending. No softness, no waste. The back door opened with a groan. She stepped outside into the sharp morning, breath frosting, boots crunching on a crust of fresh snow. Chickens shifted and muttered in a coop. Beyond them, a Linta shed sagged under its own weight, and the fence running along the bluff was missing 3 rails. Clara turned her face toward the wind and closed her eyes a moment. The cold bit at her cheeks, but it steadied her. He hadn't thrown them out yet, but that didn't mean he meant to keep them. When she returned, he was in the main room again, standing over the hearth with sleeves rolled and a knife in one hand, slicing rough slabs from a new loaf. His eyes flicked toward her, then away. "I can mend that fence," she said. He paused. "You got a wagon wheel out there with a cracked spoke. I can fix that too. Might not be pretty, but it'll turn." He set the knife down and looked at her fully, as if weighing her voice against the silence it disturbed. His face gave away nothing, but after a long moment, he nodded once. So that day she worked. The children stayed inside, close to the fire, playing quiet games with scraps of cloth and whittled sticks she found in a box. Clara pulled her coat tight and carried the broken rail across the snow, the cold cutting through to bone. Her hands went raw from the hammer's handle. She found old nails in the shed, twisted and rusted, but she bent them straight again and made them hold. He watched her once from the doorway. She didn't look back. By dusk, she'd done what she said and a little more. She scraped ice from the water trough, chopped wood until her fingers stiffened. She milked a goat with a crooked horn and brought the pail inside herself. He handed her a fresh shirt and dry socks without speaking. She murmured thanks and changed behind the kitchen door while the children slept again, this time in the cot and under a real quilt. She noticed when she crept out that his rifle was now leaned by the door, not above it. He sat at the table with a tin cup in front of him, steam curling into the lamplight. "Are you gonna let us stay more than tonight?" she asked, voice low. He didn't answer, but he poured a second cup, pushed it toward her, and didn't look away. She sat down. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was thick and full, like the pause between thunder and rain. She wrapped her hands around the cup and drank. The tea was bitter but warm. "You live alone?" she asked. Still no answer, but he didn't rise, didn't leave. She studied his hands, strong, rough-hewn, the kind of hands that split logs and stitched wounds. There were small scars up his forearms, pale against his skin. She wondered who tended him when he got those, or if he had. "I used to be a teacher," she said, not sure why, before. Before the sickness took her husband, before the bank took their land, before the hunger set in and then the running. His gaze moved to her for a moment, something like interest beneath it or memory, then back to the fire. "I don't want your charity," she said, "but I can work. I can clean, mend, look after stock, teach your letters if you've got books. I just need time, a place where they can sleep and eat." The man stood then, and for a moment she feared he meant to show her out. But instead, he crossed the room, bent to the hearth, and added a log. The fire leapt higher. He turned, and for the first time she saw his mouth twitch, not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one. He pointed to the hallway beyond the hearth. A door stood ajar, a room. She rose slow, careful not to jostle the silence between them. Carried Rachel first, then Matthew, then took Nell's hand and led her through the narrow hall. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a cracked window, and a chest at the foot. The air smelled of cedar and old books. It was more than enough. She laid them down, pulled the quilt over their shoulders, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching the snow fall sideways through the pane. There was no promise in what the man had done, no spoken agreement, but she'd read enough faces in these hard years to know this much. He had bread, he had silence, and now, for whatever reason, he'd given them a room, not just floorboards, not just one night. It was the start of something, not safety yet, not trust. But maybe, if she was careful, if the wind stayed turned, they had the edge of a beginning. The thaw came late that year. Weeks passed before the drifts loosened their grip on the earth, and brown patches began to show in the hollows near the chicken coop. Until then, the world remained white and muffled, the days thick with smoke from the hearth and the low voices of children learning to be warm again. He still didn't speak much. Clara learned his name by accident, overheard one morning when a pair of riders passed through seeking directions to the river fork. "Ask Wit," one had muttered, tipping his hat toward the house before they rode on. So that was it, Wit, a short, heavy name that fit him like the coat he wore even when the snow fell sideways. She didn't use it right away. It felt too intimate, something you earned over time like firelight or trust. Instead, she spoke in action. She kept the house in order, swept the hearth, boiled the wash, patched every tear in the children's clothes with even stitches. When the hens slowed their laying, she found a hidden clutch beneath the porch and brought in 6 eggs like treasure. She hung damp mittens by the stove, dried boots with care, learned which floorboards creaked and which didn't. In return, he fed them, quietly, unfailingly. Stew or cornbread or dried apple and cheese, whatever the season allowed. He handed out bread like it was a kind of answer. It was not kindness, not the way Clara had known it in another life, soft, laced with sugar and sweet words, but something steadier, more like gravity, and she came to understand it as its own form of mercy. Nights were still hard. Rachel teethed and whimpered in her sleep, and Clara would walk the length of the small room until the baby's breathing steadied. Nell wet the bed once and sobbed until Clara pressed her against her shoulder and whispered stories she barely remembered. Matthew stayed silent and still, but sometimes she woke to find him watching the door, as if expecting it to open and something worse to walk through. She did not ask Wit for more. Spring edged in one morning with a break in the clouds and a sound Clara hadn't heard in months. Birdsong, just one. A sparrow perched on the fence rail, calling into the pale light like it had been waiting the whole winter to speak. Clara found herself smiling, unguarded. That same day, Wit handed her a folded paper, thick with dust and creases. She opened it and stared at the crude map drawn in pencil. A trail, a mill, 3 homesteads marked with initials. "What's this?" she asked, though something in her stomach already knew. He tapped a mark on the lower right. 12 miles south, he said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse. "Mill Town, early season hiring." Clara blinked. He'd spoken, and the words were clear enough. This was her way out if she wanted it. A chance to earn a wage, find a roof of her own. A choice. She held the paper a moment longer, then folded it neat and set it on the table. "Thank you," she said. She looked at the children, then back at him. But not yet. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders eased just slightly. He nodded once and turned back to the door as if nothing had passed between them. A week later, she found a worn book left on the table beside her tea. Its cover was cracked leather, the spine hand-stitched, and inside were stories, a mix of scripture, fables, and lessons in penmanship. She turned the pages slowly, fingers trembling. That night by firelight, she read aloud to the children. Her voice had grown hoarse from months of silence, but the rhythm returned like muscle memory. Nell leaned close. Matthew didn't blink. Even Rachel stayed still in her lap. And Wit, she saw him in the corner of her eye, stood just beyond the edge of the room, unmoving. He stayed there until the last line was read. That became the rhythm of their days, work and small kindnesses, bread and books, no promises but presents. One morning after breakfast, Clara stepped outside to hang the wash and found Wit already at the post. The old line had frayed, so he was stringing a new one. His hands moved sure and quiet, knotting the twine with a farmer's patience. She handed him a clothespin. Their fingers brushed. He didn't pull away. The wind shifted and carried the scent of earth for the first time in months. Somewhere unseen, the thaw was winning. Clara didn't smile, not exactly, but something inside her, something she thought had frozen solid, tilted toward warmth. By late April, the children ran barefoot through the yard, their laughter rising with the swell of the thaw. The river below the bluff roared with meltwater, thick and brown and full of broken limbs carried from far-off places. Clara watched them from the porch, a mending basket in her lap, one eye always on Rachel where she toddled near the fence, hands outstretched like she meant to catch the wind. The land was waking, buds pressed pale and tight against branch tips, the hens scratched deeper, greedy for thawed worms, the goat gave milk thick and sweet. Everywhere the hush of winter gave way to the shuffle of life returning. Whit built a new fence gate without being asked. He worked in the early hours, shirt sleeves rolled, his breath visible until the sun cleared the trees. Clara brought him water and once, without thinking, brushed sawdust from his shoulder. He stilled at the touch but didn't move away. Later that day, she found the old barn cleared of broken boards and long-dead hay. In its place stood a corner he'd swept clean, with a crude table, a wooden stool, and the book she'd been reading to the children, laid open to the last page she'd marked. She taught there every morning now, while Whit worked the fields. Nell traced her letters in ash on a slate. Matthew counted dried beans in rows. Rachel scribbled in the dirt with a stick, murmuring nonsense and songs only she understood. Clara's hands stayed busy. She planted a kitchen garden, onions, carrot seed, wildflower along the edge. She boiled soap, cut his shirts down to size for Matthew, and fashioned Rachel a bonnet from the hem of her own worn dress. At night she and Whit sat by the fire while the children slept. Sometimes he carved small animals or birds from spare wood and gave them without ceremony. Clara mended or read, her voice soft and low. He rarely spoke, but his silences had changed. They were no longer a wall, but a kind of shelter. She had learned to live inside them, to listen to what he did not say. One night she asked, quiet as the hush between sparks, "Were you ever married?" He shook his head. She nodded slow and looked at the flames. "I was." He didn't press, he just listened. So she told him, of Eli, whose hands had been calloused like Whit's but quicker to anger, of the fever that took him in 3 days and the debt that came faster, of burying him under frost too hard to break proper and walking away from the farm with nothing but her children and a sack of seed that never sprouted. "I never meant to beg," she said, "but I would've if I had to." Whit didn't answer. Instead, he stood, crossed the room, and took down a tin box from the shelf. From it, he drew something wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to her. Inside was a length of blue ribbon, soft as breath, faded but clean. She stared. "Found it in the rafters last fall," he said, voice low. "Didn't belong to me." Her hands trembled as she touched it. "It does now," she whispered. The next morning, he saddled the mule and left without saying where. Clara watched him ride out along the trail that curved toward the distant mill town. He was gone 2 days. The house felt emptier than it should have. The children asked when he'd return. Clara only said soon. When he came back, his coat was dusted with trail, and there was a burlap sack tied behind his saddle. Inside were boots, 3 small pairs, new stitched and meant for spring, and a bolt of cloth the color of dusk. He set it on the table, then turned away, busying himself with the harness. Clara reached out, touched the fabric. "You didn't have to." "I know." She folded the cloth and pressed it to her chest. "You're a quiet man," she said. He met her eyes. "Don't mean I don't hear things." From that day on, he took his supper with them at the table. Not every night, but most. The rain came heavy in May, driving in from the west like something sent to cleanse what winter left behind. It pattered constant on the roof and filled the dry creek until it swelled over its banks. Whit tacked oilcloth over the windows and lined the door with old grain sacks to keep the flood from seeping in. Clara boiled potatoes over a low fire while the children played by lamplight, their games quieter now, patient with the pace of weather. Rachel had begun to speak in full sentences, crooked, lovely things strung together with pride. Nell was learning to read by sound, mouth moving silently over each word. And Matthew, though still quiet, had taken to following Whit when chores allowed. He fetched nails, held tools, mirrored every motion. Whit never spoke to him much, but he never turned him away either. One afternoon, during a lull in the storm, Clara stepped outside to shake out the rugs. The clouds hung low and pale green, warning of more to come. But the wind had settled, and she breathed deep the scent of damp earth, grass, and the promise of growing things. That's when she saw the stranger. He stood at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, one boot sunk in mud. A lank man, older than Whit, with a crooked mouth and eyes that didn't match. His coat hung loose on his frame like he'd once been broader. "Ma'am," he said. Clara's hand tightened around the rug. "I ain't here for trouble," the man added. "Just got word a woman with 3 young'uns was shelterin' here, thought she might be kin." She stepped down from the porch. "Who told you that?" He gave a name she didn't recognize, then said, "You Boone's widow." She didn't answer. "I knew Eli," he continued. "Fought with him once over a mule, lost a tooth for my trouble. Sorry he's gone, you always looked too soft for him." Clara's breath hitched. "You got business." "I got word there's work north of the ridge, need folk who know how to drive oxen. Thought maybe you was movin' on. I could help with that." She took a step forward. "We're not." The man studied her a long beat, then nodded slow. "Well, maybe that's best." Whit stepped out then, hammer still in hand, face unreadable. He didn't speak, just stood there beside her. The stranger looked between them, spat into the mud. "You found solid ground then." Clara lifted her chin. "We're standing on it." The man tipped his hat once, turned, and left the way he came. Whit didn't ask questions, but later that night he checked the door twice, left the rifle within reach. The rains passed. Wildflowers bloomed in the field behind the barn, and the children ran through them trailing petals in joy. Clara planted herbs in a box along the window sill. She stitched Nell a new dress from the bolt he'd brought. Cooked biscuits from the lard she'd bartered for with 3 jars of goat's milk. They lived, not just survived. And one evening, as the sun poured honey gold through the windows, Whit brought out a wooden box he'd been carving in secret. Inside were small keepsakes, a length of twine, 3 polished stones, a feather, and a note scrawled in careful letters. "This house is yours, if you'll stay." No signature, just those words carved with care, etched in silence. Clara sat long with that box in her lap, her heart full and aching. Then she went to the stove, lifted the kettle, and filled 2 cups. She carried one to Whit, who stood just outside the door, watching the last of the light slide over the hills. He took the cup from her hand. Their fingers brushed again, and this time he held on a little longer. "I'll stay," she said. And for the first time he smiled, not the ghost of one, a real one, small, tired, but true. By midsummer, the garden gave back what Clara had planted. Squash heavy on the vine, onions fat beneath the soil, wild mint edging the path with sharp green breath. She woke before sunup now, not out of fear but habit, and moved through the house with a quiet purpose, her feet familiar with every board and creak. The children grew into the rhythm of it. Nell took to helping with the washing, sleeves rolled and jaw set like her mother. Matthew learned to mend tack with Whit, his hands steadying into skill. Rachel danced barefoot through the yard, wild curls bouncing, her laughter trailing like birdsong. The house had changed, too. Whit added a second cot to the room, built shelves where the books could live, and strung wind chimes made of old silverware from the porch. He never spoke of why, but Clara knew. These weren't temporary things. They were roots. Sometimes she caught him watching the children with a softness that surprised her. Not longing, not regret. Just a kind of quiet awe, like he couldn't believe they were real and his life had space for them now. And for her. They hadn't spoken of love, not in so many words, but it was there, laid out in the doing, in how he saved her the last piece of bread without fuss, in how she rubbed liniment into his knuckles after long days mending the roof, in the way their bodies moved beside each other, no longer out of necessity but choice. One night a late storm rolled in hot wind and heavy thunder. Rachel whimpered in her sleep, and Clara carried her to the big bed without thinking. Nell came next, then Matthew, quiet but wakeful. She opened the door to Whit's room, children in her arms, eyes steady. "There's enough space," she said. He stood from where he'd been sitting, and without a word, stepped aside. They all fit, barely, but it was enough. The bed became a raft in that storm, 5 bodies folded together against the noise and dark. Clara lay still in the quiet that came after, Rachel's breath warm against her neck, Whit's hand resting near hers on the quilt. In the morning, he was the one to rise first, to stoke the fire and set the kettle to boil. The days turned hotter, the fields taller. And then one evening, Clara found herself sitting alone on the porch as the sun fell, a letter in her lap. It was from the mill town, a real offer, steady pay, a place in the schoolhouse for Nell come fall. She read it twice, then folded it small and tucked it in her apron pocket. She didn't need it. That night after the children were asleep and the house had stilled, she found Wit out by the fence, his hands resting on the top rail, the stars reflected in his eyes. She stepped beside him. "They wrote me from town," she said, "about work." He didn't look at her. "You going?" "No." His shoulders shifted just barely, a breath. "Why?" he asked. She reached out and laid her hand over his. "Because I have bread now," she said, "and silence, and a room that's not just spare, it's ours." He turned to her then, fully, and she saw it plain in his face. The history, the hunger, the long ache of loneliness stitched into every line, but also the strength that had made room for her, for them. "You're not just passing through?" he asked. She shook her head. "I came looking for a place," she said, "but what I found was someone who stayed. That's rarer than land or walls or wages." Wit nodded, slow, as if every word she'd said was something he'd waited years to hear. They stood there hand in hand, under the hush of the stars and the wind through tall grass. No grand vows, no promises, just a quiet, steady truth. In the house behind them, 3 children dreamed in safety. And in the dark, 2 hearts, once hollowed by loss, beat together, full and known. Not rescued. Recognized.